Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Tracy Bates, the curator here with the Interior Museum, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here to our monthly lecture series with Interior Museum. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of new ones as well, so that's great. Quick bit of housekeeping. If you like today's lecture or you've not been to others, we do them every month, typically on the first Wednesday of the month at this time, and usually in this room. Next month we have Dr. Jason Goldberg coming in he's a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, talking about invasive species and specifically, can we eat our way out of a crisis? So kind of a very diverging series of topics that we cover with Interior Museum. Also wanted to give you a heads up, and there's a poster outside. It's a rarity that the museum itself is open on a Saturday because we are in a federal building, but we do have an open house coming up on October 18th. It's a Saturday, 10 to 4. It's a great chance to bring your family and friends in to see our posterity exhibition and also the closing of our See America traveling exhibition. We have some craft projects with silk screening that ties in directly with those two shows as well. We'll be doing some fall greeting cards and encourage you all to attend if you've not seen the exhibition already. So, turning our attention to today's talk, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Renee Braden and Cathy Hunter. They are both with National Geographic, and I was just tallying up, and combined they have over 50 years at the National Geographic Society. I won't divvy that out as to how many years apiece, but Cathy is a senior archivist. Renee is the manager of archives and special collections, and together they end up doing quite a bit of, in terms of outreach and interpretation on behalf of the Society. That ranges anywhere from giving kind of orientation classes called High Adventure internally to staff and people onboarding and new to the Society, but also providing tours to visitors and development prospects and other special VIPs and donors. Also, they are working to build an in-house encyclopedia of National Geographic Society history called The Timeline. They work extensively with their oral history program and also with a lot of the explorers and kind of documenting both past, present, and future of the Geographic's mission. It's a great pleasure to welcome them here today, and they're going to be talking about that kind of intersection between National Geographic Society and the national parks. We didn't know this. I was telling them we didn't realize this when we booked the lecture for today, but it is the 50th anniversary today of Lyndon Baines Johnson signing into law the Wilderness Act, and so that is kind of a neat legacy of public lands. And of course we have our National Park Service centennial coming up in a couple of years, and so it's very timely that we have this kind of entree to National Park Service history and the kind of founding blocks of with some outside support from National Park Service and National Geographic. So without any further ado, Renee and Cathy.
Thank you for coming, and thanks for turning out for this presentation on our long and storied history together, the National Geographic and the National Park Service. However, I'm going to start a little bit before the creation of either organization because this scene that is up here is from the work of one of our founders, Captain Clarence Dutton. He was one of the 33 founders of the Geographic, and he was a geologist who was quite taken with the Grand Canyon area. And this is from the tertiary history of the Grand Canyon. And Dutton, as I said, was a geologist, but not by training. He worked for the Ordnance Survey, but our most illustrious founder probably, Major John Wesley Powell, he recognized Dutton's latent genius and that he would be a wonderful geologist, so he got him detailed to his survey. Powell's survey was one of the four great surveys of the West. I mean, at this time, after the Civil War, I mean, we're still a very young country, the U.S., and we still had all this territory west of the Mississippi, quite a bit, which still needed mapping. And the Colorado Plateau was considered one of the most difficult, and that had not yet been mapped. So he got Dutton to do that work for him. And Dutton, he said he had to turn to Eastern literature to give him the language he needed. He thought the Grand Canyon was the sublimest thing on earth. And in fact, he calls this view Panorama from Point Sublime. And looking through his tertiary history, he has wonderful names like Vishnu's Temple and things like that, because he said it just doesn't do justice. And he said the Grand Canyon, you find yourself a poet. It just makes the heart quicken and the throat tighten, he said. So this is Dutton's boss while he's on detail from the Ordnance Survey. This is John Wesley Powell with a Native American. And Powell was really one of the most prominent scientists of his day. And he managed to raft down the Colorado River and into the Grand Canyon. That, having lost his right arm at the Battle of Shiloh, he survived that and went on to a great scientific career. And he wanted to systematically map the West. He was always at loggerheads with Congress for funding to do this, of course, but eventually he did get most of his mapping done. And many of our founders, besides Powell and Dutton, worked for the federal government. Powell entrusted much of the mapping to his brother-in-law, Almond Thompson, also Henry Gannett, the premier map maker of the United States at that time, and G.K. Gilbert, who mapped the Henry Mountains. So eventually the work of the 4 Great Western Surveys, it was combined into one organization, which became the U.S. Geological Society, and Powell very quickly became the director of that. So I am going to go on and turn this over to Renee, who can tell you all about a wonderful camping trip.
Thanks. So for the first 10, 15 years of the National Geographic's history, it's National Geographic in title, but mainly local Washington-based in activities. As Cathy said, there were 33 men, mostly government scientists, who were the founders. We were beginning to fund research. We were having a lecture program. We put out the National Geographic magazine, the journal of the activities of the organization. But we had not fully been able to fund the types of research that those 33 men wanted to do. That came a little bit later as the membership widened and they were able to do some of these things. But from these Washington connections, and this is one of the things that Cathy and I sort of love in our research, because then we get to walk around downtown and sort of see where it all happened. But Washington was really the seat of science for the United States. The government was funding science, as Cathy said, with the USGS and mapping, a lot of mapping and topographic studies out west. So this town is where scientists come. And so they all have a great energy together. They socialize together. They formed a lot of other organizations. They serve on the board of regents of the Smithsonian. And, you know, people say Washington is still its own small town now, and it definitely was then. And so the sort of the spirit of all of these different men in Washington sort of builds up and leads to better things. And the Mather Mountain Party happened in 1915. It's named after Stephen Mather, who became the first director of the Park Service and was on the board of National Geographic Society right after that. But again, it's the spirit amongst all these people that lead to some of these things. And the Mather Mountain Party begins with Stephen Mather was a Chicago industrialist millionaire. He was also called the Borax King. He invented the slogan 20 Mule Team Borax. And so he made all of his money in borax and industry. And as all good Victorian, Edwardian era Americans, you know, did the grand tour of Europe and all of those kinds of things, Stephen Mather and his family traveled all over Europe, and particularly Switzerland, where the public lands, the parks, were pristine. There were paths in them. They were well maintained. They were for the benefit of the citizenry. And Stephen Mather went out west here in America, went to Yosemite. He was from California, and he had a great love of the big trees. But even though part of it was a national park and part of it was a state park, very poorly maintained, could hardly get around in it, wasn't protected. There were private lands within the federal parts, and it was sort of disjointed and kind of forgotten. And as a patriotic American, he was appalled that why should Europeans have better parks than Americans? That's an outrage. And he wrote, as people should do, he wrote to somebody here in Washington and said somebody should do something about this. And he wrote to the Secretary of the Interior, Franklin K. Lane, who was also on the board of National Geographic. And Franklin Lane wrote back and said, if you think you can do a better job than we're doing, you should come here and run some of these parks. And he did. He took him up on the challenge. Mather came to Washington, realized that just the Department of Interior alone, with all of its varied interests and needs and responsibilities, couldn't manage the parks the way they should be. And so the need for a National Park Service Bureau, a separate one to manage the parks, was what was needed. So Mather puts together this Mather Mountain Party of influential writers, newspaper men, businessmen, and he takes them on a 2-week pack trip through the High Sierra, through the Sequoia, and eventually they climb Mount Whitney. This photograph is taken by the president and editor of National Geographic, Gilbert H. Grosvenor. He was on that trip. This trip started out with, they lost a few because Mather, to sort of make it more adventurous, dramatized, well, you might, there's some of those bones over there might be human bones, and watch out for bears, and a few not as hardy types. One claimed a toothache and said he had to leave. But of all of the men, Emerson Howell, the great story author and novelist of adventure and sort of Western novels, was there. Also, the ranking Republican senator on the Appropriations Committee was, or the congressman was on that trip, and so a couple of other politicians as well. Mr. Grosvenor, the interesting thing about, I'll call him our Mr. Grosvenor for the Geographic, is that he had been born in Constantinople, as it was then called, and had traveled all over the world. Just before this, he had been in Tsarist Russia and took a series of photographs that are still sort of incredibly beautiful and impressive and are used for research a lot at the Geographic. He had been all over the world. He had never been west of the Mississippi in the U.S. Again, the East Coast was the heaviest center of population in the U.S., and people looked in the other direction. This was a life-altering experience, this trip for him. He was amazed and fell in love with the big trees, and was sort of one of the more active he was one of the younger, I think, too. But when they eventually climbed Mount Whitney, he sprinted. And this is like over 14,000 feet. And a few of them, there was a doctor with them too, and he had advised a few of the older ones not to go all the way to the top. But Mr. Grosvenor sprinted all the way to the top, the last several hundred yards or so. But from this trip on, he pledges the support, everything that the Geographic can do to bring about a park bureau, a National Park Service, and to support the parks in any way possible. Stephen Mather comes on the board of the Geographic. When they get back to Washington, it's Mr. Grosvenor, Mather, and just a few other people pulling all-nighters, writing the legislation. The National Geographic published an entire issue, its April 1916 issue, the land of the best. And it's pretty much a photo essay to a love letter to America, to Americans, saying these lands are worth preserving and protecting in a broader way. And if you believe that, write to your congressman. National Geographic is not really an advocacy organization, but I would say we have a lot of examples where we spur our membership to action. And so we touch the line with regard to the Park Service. Grosvenor hand-delivered a copy of this issue into every senator and congressman's hands when the legislation was about to come up. And it passed, and it had been defeated a few other times. So the legislation passed. In addition to this, and that's Grosvenor, one of the base of the trees. One of the other things he did on this trip was Mather had said, Mather, who was more experienced around the big trees, picked out camping sites where he thought it was the most safe so that nobody would get crushed by a limb, huge limb falling in the middle of the night or something like that. But Grosvenor, again, so enamored of the experience and of the trees, insisted on putting his sleeping bag right at the base so he could just look up. So Mather, the marketing genius, it worked on our young Mr. Grosvenor. And that's on that same trip when all the gentlemen on it ring around one of the great trees. So the legislation passed, and one of the next things to happen, which still happens, the Congress passed the legislation, but didn't appropriate enough money. They appropriated $50,000 to buy some of the land still held by private individuals to merge into the existing park lands. And when they appropriated the $50,000, the owner of the land raised the price to $70,000, and Congress said no more. $50,000 is all we were going to give. And so the whole thing was in danger of falling apart. And so Mr. Grosvenor went to the board of the Geographic, and the Geographic bought the land, paid the extra $20,000, and donated the land to the United States. And so there are a number of those types of instances where the Geographic buys land on from private individuals and donates it to the Park Service.
So another way we've helped hopefully forward the mission of the Park Service is through our funding of scientific research. And we have a research committee that has it's been lending its name to expeditions since 1890. And this is an early example. This is Dr. Robert Griggs. In 1912, there was a cataclysmic eruption in the Katmai district of Alaska, and no one could get up there for a year. It was so bad. But for the next few years, the Geographic funded him and a team of scientists to go up and explore the area. And they found, the whole town of Kodiak had been buried in ash. And that summer of 1912 was sometimes called a summer without a summer. I mean, the USGS knew something big had happened. So Griggs goes up there and to find out. He's a biologist and a geologist. And I love this picture in particular. I mean, it looks like it could be any explorer wading through a river, but he's actually wading through a river of quicksand. And he would talk about how he would take a step and sink down and sink, and finally the sand and dirt would coalesce under his feet, and then he could take another step and another step. And it was really a very hazardous journey. At one point, the way this gets its name is they come to a pass, and when they look down as far as they could see, there are fumaroles, and the steam is venting, so that's how it gets the name, the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. And he said they had to be very careful walking along. They would use sticks to walk along in that area, because if the ground wasn't stable, they could fall right through and be boiled alive. But he said in some ways it's a great camping exercise because, you know, they would put their food on to cook and it was steam heat, so nothing ever burned. Although one camper complained they couldn't fry bacon that way, it didn't work. And after they'd been hiking all day, the steam heat felt really, really good on their muscles. But on the other hand, nothing ever dried in camp. But anyway, Griggs wrote about this so movingly in the magazine, and people were so interested that it became a national monument and in Katmai, and the funerals are all played out now, but they went on for many, many years. And another example is Carlsbad Caverns, and this was brought to our attention, and we sent a scientist named Willis T. Lee to investigate Carlsbad. Yes, 1924, and he mapped and photographed the caverns, and then the society supported the legislation that eventually resulted in the creation of Carlsbad Caverns. And Renee touched on this. Grosvenor was once again instrumental in this legislation. He was a very quiet sort, but he was always working behind the scenes. He came from an influential family. I think he was related to Taft, I believe, a cousin. Yeah, and he was very good at working the Washington scene to get what he wanted done. So, and I'm going to go back a bit because we didn't mention dendrochronology. There was an expedition that we funded in the 1920s, and this was in conjunction with the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology. And Neil Judd was exploring Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, which would become a national monument. And Judd was having trouble determining the age of this Anasazi culture. And he had heard about this new science of dendrochronology, of tree ring dating. You know, trees lay down a new ring every year. And so we also funded what were called the beam expeditions. And this was this money was given to Dr. A.E. Douglas in Arizona, and he took some beams from the buildings in Pueblo Bonito and using this new science of dendrochronology. And it's still in use, even with radiocarbon dating. Dendrochronology is still a part of the archaeologist's toolkit that gets used. And this is a post-World War II one. During World War II, unfortunately, we couldn't fund many expeditions at all, so we'll jump ahead. But Frank and John Craighead Jr., they're the twin sons of grantee, John Craighead, and they had been affiliated with the Geographic since they were 19 years old. They had helped teach falconry to the son of a Maharaj in India. They had lectured and written for the society, and they were the first, among the first to use radio telemetry, radio tracking of mammals. And their grizzly bear studies that took place over a number of years are really the standard by which others are measured today. And they also used Landsat to track golden eagles. And that is another study where it's the technology has been used from things as small as voles to even tigers and snow leopards.
So again, the Redwoods, the Save the Redwoods League was begun in the late 19-teens. Again, our hero of the time, Mr. Grosvenor, was put on the board and put on a communications. It had sort of an old-fashioned version of PR committee, but he was on that, and the Geographic, through a succession of Grosvenors and editors and board members, pushed very hard for the setup of the Redwoods National Park. There had been a smaller portion of it. Certain, again, like the sequoias, there are tracks that are saved and there are tracks that are really vulnerable, and we're trying to protect them from the logging interest. The Redwoods National Park, part of that program, or when it was made into a park in the 1960s, really begins in the 1950s with a National Geographic grant. Connie Worth, or Dr. Conrad Worth, who was the director of the Park Service, again, on the board of National Geographic. There had been a huge storm on the coast, and a lot of big trees came down, and there was a lot of flooding once the trees came down. And Connie Worth said to Melville Bell Grosvenor, son of Gilbert H. Grosvenor, we need to go out and figure out how much damage was done, and it's possible that the area of the biggest trees is, that we've lost some of the very, very biggest trees in there. And they had to use logging roads, and the Geographic put together a research grant to study that. It went over a fairly long period of time, and eventually, and they mapped and sort of found what became known as the General Sherman tree, the largest tree. But in the July 1966 issue of the magazine, again, this is, we talk about this again because the Geographic steps right up to the advocacy line. And we publish a map that at the end says, such a part, it's recommending which tracts to save and which tracts to become a national park. And what a benefit it would be. And at the very end, if you agree that these great trees should indeed be preserved in a national park, you can help by writing to your senators and congressmen. And I think that anything to do with the Park Service is the only time that there is language like that in the National Geographic magazine. A very, very prominent mid-20th century editor of the Geographic used to have the expression that we hold up the torch, we don't apply it. But we come very close because of the love and relationship between the Geographic and the parks. Another thing that we wanted to mention is in the funding is Russell Cave. But when the Russell Cave site was founded, it was on a individual's farm in Alabama, and National Geographic bought the entire 268-acre farm and again donated it to the government to become Russell Cave National, I think it's a site, national monument or national site.
Okay, so it's been said that the national parks are the greatest idea that America ever had, and eventually it catches on internationally. I mean, for years we had been supporting the work of a young English woman named Jane Goodall, who Louis Leakey had sent to the banks of the Gombe Stream in what was then Tanganyika. And he sent her there because he thought that the chimps living along that stream, he thought their habitat was like that of early man. And being a paleoanthropologist, he wanted her to gather some data for him. She thought she would be there a few years. Her research camp, that was in the early 60s, her research camp is still going in the Gombe Stream. Jane Goodall just turned 80 back in April, and she still goes around the world promoting habitat research, getting kids interested in the environment, and particularly trying to improve the status, the care of animals that are kept in research labs. But anyway, eventually her work, her area in the Gombe Stream became a park in Tanzania, and as well as another scientist, Michael Fay, a biologist, and he conducted what was called a megatransect, cutting a straight line across Africa, never deviating, and gathering all kinds of scientific data along the way. And when the article came out, and he showed the article and the photos of our photographer, Nick Nichols, they had a meeting with the president of Gabon, who was just really mesmerized and said he had no idea. He had no idea that such places existed in his own country, and it inspired him to set aside approximately 10% of Gabon as protected area. And Mike Fay has gone on to do other transects. He's done a mega flyover in Africa. He's also done a transect of the Redwoods. And I'll read you this quote. This was an 11-month trek from the Big Sur to just beyond the Oregon border. And he says, after walking through every kind of managed forest and talking to foresters on all sides of the issue, Fay is convinced there's a better way. Grow bigger trees which can maximize wood production while providing good habitat. You've got to start thinking about this as an ecosystem, he says. All these plantations might as well be growing corn, but if you want clean water, salmon, wildlife, and high-quality lumber, you've got to have a forest. So we will end here with the BioBlitzes that were started here in DC in Rock Creek Park. This is a celebration, a years-long celebration coming up to the National Park Centennial. And the idea of a BioBlitz is to get professional scientists along with volunteers to go into a national park and over a 24-hour period find as many new species as possible. This picture is of a nest of Harris hawks in Saguaro National Park, and I think that next year is the last one, and that's in Hawaii's Volcanoes National Park. So,
it's a great project for kids.
Yes, it's a great project for kids.
Lots of kids get involved in this.